The smell hit them long before they ever saw the light. One of the workers admitted later that he assumed it was just a dead animal, maybe something that had crawled under the floorboards and couldn't find its way back out into the world. That changed when the floor finally gave way and they lowered a lamp down into the suffocating dark, because what they found down there wasn't an animal at all. The space beneath Sterling House didn't exist on any blueprint, and while the county records claimed every child who lived there had been adopted or placed with a family, those papers were nothing but a lie. There is a specific kind of silence in the hollows of Appalachia that outsiders often mistake for peace, but it isn't peace at all. It is the silence of a community that learned a long time ago that certain things are never said out loud, not because the truth is a secret, but because speaking it changes nothing and costs you everything you have. Sterling House sat right in the middle of that silence for over 50 years, a 3-story brick building at the end of a dirt road that most people could point to on a map, but nobody visited without a very good reason. Counties in that part of the mountains built places like Sterling House because they had a problem they didn't know how to solve. They were dealing with children who lost their parents to mining accidents or the fever, and families living in poverty so deep that surrendering a child wasn't an act of cruelty, but a desperate calculation. The institution became the county's easy answer to a hard question, taking the children in and keeping them off the roads so the local government could simply close a file and look the other way. The Sterling family was the exact kind of name that made a system like that possible. They were old money by regional standards, with deep ties to the local government, and having their name on the front of a building was enough to make the whole operation look respectable to the public. They didn't just donate the land for the site, they also sat on the board and hand-picked the administrators, which gave the institution a sense of permanence that felt like it had been blessed by something higher than the county itself. In a place like this, nobody was going to stand up and question a Sterling-backed project in public, because that just wasn't how things worked. If you looked at the paperwork, Sterling House appeared to run a clean operation. The intake records carefully logged every name and age, along with where the child came from and why they had arrived at the door. The placement records showed when they left and where they supposedly went, often listing a receiving family or a new county to make it look like the system cared about where these kids ended up. County officials who bothered to look at the books wouldn't have seen anything obviously wrong, though the truth is that most of them probably never bothered to check the ledgers at all. What the neighbors saw was much harder to put into a report. They noticed that children would arrive at the house but were almost never seen playing outside, and they saw that the lower windows had been bricked over back in the 1920s without anyone ever giving a reason why. On cold mornings, people driving past would see smoke rising from a section of the building that didn't even have a chimney on the outside wall. People noticed these things and talked quietly to those they trusted, but the Sterlings were powerful, and the county was the county, so the silence held firm. The building finally closed its doors in 1949 without anyone asking many questions, and it stayed that way until a demolition crew arrived 3 years later. The demolition contract was supposed to be a routine job.
The county had held on to the Sterling House property for 3 years after the doors finally closed, and by 1952, the local government decided it was time to clear the lot and level whatever was left standing. The crew that showed up that morning wasn't there to investigate the past or look for secrets. They were just there to work and get the site ready for whatever the land might become later. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from a smell or a sound, but from the simple math of the building itself. One of the workers was moving through the lower level, where the old utility rooms were located, when he noticed that the exterior wall and the interior wall didn't line up correctly. From the outside, the building ran another 12 to 15 feet past where the interior wall stopped, which made no sense given the layout he was looking at. He thought it was just a foundation anomaly, or perhaps some extra thick masonry used for structural support. But then he tapped on the surface and heard a hollow ring. The sound that came back wasn't solid stone, and it told him immediately that there was an empty space waiting on the other side. They found the door hidden behind a section of wood paneling that had been mounted perfectly flush against the wall to hide any trace of an opening. There was no handle on their side of the door, and the hinges were set on the interior, which meant it had been designed to open inward from the room below. When the crew finally forced it open, the air that rushed out carried the kind of deep, biting cold that doesn't come from just being underground. It was the heavy, stagnant cold of a place that hasn't seen a breath of movement in a very long time. The smell followed right behind the cold, and that was the moment the worker who later spoke about it realized they weren't dealing with a dead animal. Animals don't stay in one place long enough to leave that kind of heavy absence behind, and the scent was something much more permanent and disturbing. They lowered a work lamp down on a long cord before anyone dared to climb through the opening to see what was down there. The light revealed a space roughly 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a ceiling so low that a grown man would have to keep his head down just to move around. The walls were made of the original stone foundation, but the floor had been finished with rough-cut boards laid directly over the dirt. Along the far wall, they saw narrow wooden structures built in tight rows, the kind of thing you would build if you needed to cram as many people as possible into a space that was never meant for human beings to live in. Someone on the crew walked to a nearby payphone and called the county sheriff's office to report what they had found. The response was fast, much faster than the worker expected for a Tuesday morning report about a strange room in a building that was supposed to be empty. By that afternoon, the entire site had been cordoned off, and the demolition crew was told to stop their work, but stay close by for questioning. County officials arrived on the scene before any state-level authorities were even notified, and the initial report filed that evening was only 4 paragraphs long. It confirmed that an undocumented sub-level space had been discovered beneath the structure, but it described the area as a simple storage room. It noted that some materials of undetermined origin were found inside, yet it didn't describe what those materials were or recommend any kind of real investigation. The document was signed by a county administrator whose family had attended the same church as the Sterlings for 30 years, and it seemed designed to make the whole thing go away. To understand what was actually kept in that dark space, you have to look at the records first, because the paperwork is what made the discovery so horrifying.
The official record said these children had left the facility and moved on to new lives, but the sub-basement told a completely different story. Sterling House kept 2 separate sets of records, though nobody would have used that term to describe them at the time. There were the intake logs, which were kept with meticulous care, and then there were the placement logs, which were almost entirely useless. The massive gap between these 2 sets of books tells you almost everything you need to know about what was happening behind those walls. When a child first arrived, the intake log captured every detail with chilling precision. They recorded the name, the age, a physical description, and often a note about why the child was there, such as a father passing away or a mother being unable to provide for her family. You can read those entries today and feel the weight of every single one, because each line represents a real person who walked through that door and became a number in a county system that was supposed to protect them. The placement logs are a different story entirely, and they are much thinner than the intake books, which seems backwards until you realize the truth. They record the date a child supposedly left, a name for the family taking them in, and a destination that was usually just a county name, or a vague note like, "Placed West." What you won't find is any kind of follow-up, no confirmation that the child ever arrived, and no letters or home visit records to prove the child was actually being cared for. There is absolutely nothing in the files that would let you trace a child's path past the moment they allegedly walked out of the Sterling House front door. That might look like simple administrative sloppiness from a different era, and some of it probably was, but when investigators finally looked at the records closely, they saw a pattern that wasn't random at all. The placements happened in clusters, where the intake log would fill up steadily for months, while the placement log sat completely empty. Then, in a tiny window of just 2 or 3 weeks, the records would show 10 or 12 children being placed in rapid succession, with families that don't appear anywhere else in the county's history. These families aren't in the property rolls, they aren't in the church directories, and they don't show up in any census data from the years before or after the placement. The people the records claim took these children in simply don't have a paper trail in the towns they were supposedly from. The ages of the children in these clusters skew very young, and children under 10 make up a huge portion of the placement records. This is the exact opposite of what you would expect if the system were working honestly, because older children and teenagers who could speak for themselves were much harder to make disappear. Those older kids appear in the placement logs far less often, likely because they knew who they were and where they came from. The timing of these placement clusters also lines up perfectly with specific events, like years when the Sterling House Board had recently changed or when the County Oversight Committee wasn't meeting. One major cluster happened during the winter of a year when the county recorder's office had a convenient fire that destroyed several boxes of administrative documents. Whether those facts are connected or just a series of strange coincidences is something the 1952 investigation never bothered to answer. The families who surrendered their children to Sterling House were almost always poor, isolated in the mountains, and lived far enough from the county seat that they couldn't easily check on things. They were promised that their children would get an education, good meals, and eventually a home with a family that had more resources than they did.
A few of these parents wrote letters asking about their kids in the years that followed, but the responses they got were always brief and vague. They were told the child was doing well or had been placed with a good family in another county, where they were settled and happy. 2 specific cases stand out from the rest, not because they are more dramatic, but because the records are so complete on one end and so empty on the other. There was a girl admitted at just 6 years old, and her intake record notes that her father walked her to the building himself and signed the papers with an X because he couldn't write his own name. Her placement record shows a family name and a county in a neighboring state, but that county has no record of that family ever existing. That little girl has no record of any kind after the day she arrived at Sterling House. Then there was a boy, only 4 years old, who was admitted alongside 2 older siblings who were eventually discharged and sent back to their family. He was the youngest of the 3, and his placement record lists a date only 7 months after he arrived. After that specific date, he vanishes from every document that exists in the state. The record said these children left for a better life, but the sub-basement told a much darker truth. When the investigators finally stepped into that sub-basement, 2 full days after the demolition crew first smashed through the door, they didn't find a mystery that could be solved with a single clue. There wasn't one smoking gun or a hidden confession waiting for them in the dark. Instead, it was the slow weight of everything together, the way each small detail backed up the one before it, until a picture formed that made everyone in that county want to look away. The room had been split up, not by walls, but by what happened in different corners. Along the far wall, someone had built wooden bunks directly into the stone, stacked too high and narrow enough that no adult could have ever fit inside them. You could see where the wood had been worn smooth by the weight of bodies resting there for years, not just weeks, because the grain at the edges was compressed and darkened from hands gripping the wood to climb in and out. At the opposite end of the space, a drain sat in the floor near a wooden bench, and a single pipe ran down from the ceiling to feed it. That pipe was connected to the main water lines in the utility rooms upstairs, which proves this wasn't some accidental storage area or a room they just happened to repurpose.
Someone had gone to the trouble of running plumbing down there, and they did it because they intended to keep people alive in that hole. The things left behind told the rest of the story that the county didn't want to hear. There were piles of clothing, most of it tiny, and pairs of shoes with the soles worn completely through, some so small that investigators noted they must have belonged to children under 5 years old. They found the kind of things a child clings to when they have nothing else, like a wooden button or a strip of fabric tied into the shape of a doll. And on the stone wall near the bottom bunk, someone had scratched rows of marks into the rock that didn't form words, but had the steady, haunting rhythm of someone counting the days. You have to remember that the investigators in 1952 didn't have the tools we have now, so there was no DNA testing or high-tech equipment to help them process a crime scene. All they had was what they could see with their own eyes, and whatever they chose to write down in their notebooks. The photographs from those 2 days are few and far between, and the written reports are even thinner, as if the people holding the pens were afraid of what they were documenting. Nobody ever put an official number on how many children had been kept in that room, or how long they had been there.
About a week after the discovery, the county issued a second report that was written very carefully, stating that the space seemed to have been used for housing at some point, and that more investigation would be needed to find the facts. Then, they made sure that the investigation was handled by the county itself, not the state or any outside agency, which kept the secrets exactly where they wanted them. The gap between what those men saw in that basement and what the county told the public was wide enough to hide a tragedy. If you laid out all that clothing, the different sizes would have shown a timeline of children passing through for years, and the number of bunks suggested the room could hold 30 people at a time. When you look at the intake logs for Sterling House and compare them to the placement records, there is a massive hole where 40 to 60 children simply vanish from the paperwork without a single document showing where they went. In their first public statement, the county used the word storage to describe the area, claiming it had been modified for temporary housing at some unknown time. They were quick to point out that no human remains were found during the first walkthrough, but they completely ignored the piles of children's clothes and the bunks built into the walls. Most importantly, they never mentioned those marks scratched into the stone near the floor, the ones that looked like a child was keeping track of time in the dark. But a building like that doesn't just run on its own. Someone had to keep those records, and someone had to be the one to turn the key in that lock every night. A sub-basement doesn't just seal itself off from the world. The door the crew found was hinged to open inward, and hidden so well that you couldn't find it unless you knew exactly where to look, which means it was designed by someone who knew exactly what they were trying to hide. A decision like that isn't made just once. It gets made every single morning that the door stays locked, and every time a name is written into a ledger that doesn't match reality. Sterling House was run by a board of directors, and for most of its history, the chairman was always a member of the Sterling family. The man who held that seat the longest, during the years when the records were the most suspicious, was a pillar of the community who spent his time at the Bar Association and county government meetings. He was the kind of man whose name you'd see in the paper for making a big donation or attending a building dedication, but he died in 1947, just 2 years before the place shut down. That timing was very convenient for the county, because it meant he wasn't around to answer any difficult questions in 1952. Under the board were the administrators who handled the day-to-day operations, and Sterling House went through 4 of them over the years. The first 2 were outsiders who didn't stay long, but the third administrator stayed for 11 years, which happens to be the same time the windows were bricked over and the plumbing was run to the basement. His name only shows up in the county files 3 times, always saying the institution was doing just fine. But he moved away in 1939 and died in 1950, leaving another empty chair where a witness should have been. The 4th administrator ran the building from 1939 until the doors closed in 1949, and she was actually alive when the sub-basement was discovered. The county interviewed her once, but the record of that meeting is just a single typed page that doesn't say much of anything. She admitted the sub-basement existed, but called it a storage area,
or a place to put sick children, and she claimed the decision to use it that way was made long before she ever got there. The investigators didn't ask her about the bunks or the tiny shoes, and they never followed up with her again.
It's even harder to find the regular staff, like the cooks and the laundry workers, because most of them weren't on any official county payroll. They were paid under the table or through private accounts, so their names don't exist in the public record. A few people who grew up nearby remembered a tall man who worked the lower levels, and a woman who handed out meals without ever looking anyone in the eye. But there is no record that any of these people ever spoke to the police. What we do know is that running a place like that takes more than one person. Someone had to maintain the water lines, and someone had to order enough food to feed the extra mouths hidden downstairs. The placement records had to be filled out by someone who knew those children weren't actually going to new homes, which means this wasn't just one person acting alone in the dark. It was a system, and a system needs people at every level to keep the gears turning. The placement agents, the men who were supposed to make sure these children were going to safe families, are almost completely missing from the history books. Their entire job was to verify that these kids were being taken care of, but the records show they never bothered to check. Whether they were lazy or they were being paid to look the other way is a question that nobody in 1952 was brave enough to ask. Once you realize who was actually in charge, the things they found in that basement become a lot harder to explain away as a simple mistake. The county moved fast after the discovery, but they didn't move in the direction you might expect. Within 72 hours of that demolition crew breaking through the door, the site was locked down under county authority, and access was restricted to a very short list of people. During those same 3 days, a meeting took place between county officials and at least 2 members of the Sterling family's inner circle. We only know this meeting happened because one person who attended mentioned it years later during a completely different conversation, but there is no official record of what they talked about. No one ever disclosed that this meeting even took place to the people supposed to be running the investigation. A real cover-up doesn't start with a big announcement, because it works best through boring office procedures. Jurisdiction was the favorite tool for the people in charge here. The county started asking whether the state even had the right to investigate a private institution on land that now belonged to the county. And while that question bounced back and forth between offices, the weeks just slipped away. Since the records from Sterling House had been moved into county storage 3 years before the discovery, they were already sitting inside the very system that was now investigating itself. If anyone wanted to see those files, they had to ask the county for permission, and the county made sure to process those requests at a snail's pace. The local newspaper did run a story about a week after the crew found the room, but it was short, careful, and buried deep in the back pages. It described the find as an unexpected structural feature, and mentioned that officials were looking into the situation. The editor of that paper was the same man who had praised the founding of Sterling House as a great civic achievement 50 years earlier, and his son was currently sitting on the county board of supervisors. A reporter who worked there in the 50s later wrote in a letter that a follow-up story had been drafted, but the editors refused to run it. That reporter remembered being told the story wasn't ready, or that there were legal sensitivities, so they should just wait for an official statement. When that statement finally arrived 3 weeks later, it actually said less than the first one did. By 1952, the Sterling family didn't have the kind of massive wealth or direct political power they once enjoyed.
Their fortune had thinned out quite a bit since the institution's peak years, but what they had left was something much more durable and harder to fight.
It was a web of social obligations made of men who had received favors, people who shared the same church pews, and members of the same local lodges. There was a tacit understanding that protecting the Sterling name meant protecting everyone else who stood next to them. The investigation didn't die because of one dramatic phone call from a powerful villain, but rather it was managed into the ground by a dozen small decisions made by people who knew exactly what was expected of them. The people living around Sterling House handled the discovery the way Appalachian communities often handle things they have always half known. It wasn't exactly denial, but more like a managed distance where people talked the way they always had, which was quietly and only to people they trusted.
They didn't say a word to anyone who might write it down or take it to an official office. This silence wasn't because they didn't care about the children. It was a collective understanding that the truth was finally out, but they also knew that nothing was going to change because of it. Living in a place where the truth doesn't lead to consequences requires a very specific kind of coping that is much quieter than outrage. There was never a single moment where the story broke wide open for the world to see. No big city journalist drove into the hollow to blow the lid off the case, and no state official ever successfully demanded access to the site. The story didn't crack under pressure, but instead, it calcified into something hard and permanent. It became a piece of local knowledge that people carried around in the same part of their minds as other things they knew but couldn't use. It was passed down to the next generation as a quiet warning about what the county was capable of, spoken of in whispers if it was mentioned at all, and never recorded anywhere it could be found. Some stories end with justice, and some end with a legacy of memory. This one didn't really get either. The formal investigation into Sterling House lasted for about 8 months between 1952 and the early parts of 1953. The county sheriff's office ran the whole thing, with some occasional advice from the county attorney, but no state agency was ever brought in to help. No federal authorities were ever called. The entire scope of the probe was set by the same county leaders who had been watching over Sterling House while it was still open, and that conflict of interest touched every single finding they eventually put on paper. What the investigators found was strictly limited by what they were actually willing to look for. They made a partial list of the items found in the sub-basement, and they tried to match some placement records against county data from the areas where children were supposed to have gone. They even talked to a few people who used to work at the institution. Every one of those steps was carefully measured to stop just before it reached a point where a specific county official would have to be held responsible for a crime. When the investigators finished their own internal tally, the number of children whose whereabouts couldn't be verified sat at 43. That specific number only shows up once in a rough working document that was never meant for the public to see. The final report didn't use that number, but instead mentioned a discrepancy in the files and blamed it on the messy record-keeping habits of old charities. 43 living, breathing children were reduced to a footnote about bad paperwork. Out of those 43 children, the investigators only found proof that 9 of them were still alive after they left Sterling House. These 9 kids showed up in other records like school enrollments in different counties, marriage licenses, or census entries years down the line.
That left 34 children, who were eventually listed as unconfirmed by the time the investigation wrapped up. They weren't listed as missing, they weren't listed as dead, and they weren't called victims. They were just unconfirmed. No one ever determined a cause of death for anyone, because the county never officially admitted that anyone had died at the school. After the sub-basement was entered and partially documented, the site was handed right back to the county for demolition. The work that had been paused for those first few days started up again before 1952 was even over. Whatever secrets were hidden under those rough floorboards were gone and buried before anyone with the right tools or the actual authority to ask questions could get inside. There are survivor accounts, though calling them accounts makes it sound like the county actually listened to them. Several people who grew up in Sterling House were adults living in the area by 1952, and at least 2 of them tried to talk to county officials once the news started leaking out. We don't have any record of what they said, because those conversations were never treated as formal statements or written down in the files. One woman who came forward was told the investigation was still going, and that they would call her when the time was right. That call never came, and when she died in 1971, everything she knew about that basement went into the ground with her. The legal result of all this was that not a single charge was ever filed against anyone involved with Sterling House. They didn't charge the last administrator, who was only interviewed 1 time, and they didn't charge any board members or county oversight officials. The county attorney looked at the file
and decided there wasn't enough evidence to go to court. Since the investigation was designed from day one to produce a weak file, that decision wasn't a surprise to anyone. In fact, that was the whole point of the exercise. All the physical evidence from that room, including the clothes, the personal items, and the photos, was moved into county storage along with the old files. For decades, anyone who tried to see those materials got the same canned response about how the records were archived and required a legal standing to view. To this day, no one can even confirm if that evidence still exists or if it was destroyed years ago. What survived was the only thing that ever survives when the system fails on purpose. We have the memories of the people who were there, the glaring gaps in the records that tell their own story, and the math that simply doesn't add up. There are 34 children whose lives just stop on a specific date in a placement log, and they never appear again in any record in the county that was supposed to protect them. The investigation found exactly what it was built to find, which was a way to close the book without ever asking who decided those children didn't matter. The building was torn down and the files were tucked away in a drawer, but the county still had to live with the weight of what it knew. Sterling House was not an isolated incident, and that is the reality that sits heavy in your chest when you look at the history. Throughout the 20th century, the map of America was dotted with places just like this, from the horrors of the Dozier School for Boys in Florida to the Magdalen laundries tucked away in the Northeast. Historians who spend their lives digging through these records eventually stop feeling surprised by what they find, because the blueprint never changes. You start with children from the poorest families, place them in a remote location, and hand control to men with local influence, while the official oversight exists only as a signature on a dusty piece of paper. Sterling House followed that script to the letter, but it stayed hidden longer than most because the world around it was so small.
There was no space between the home and the people meant to watch it, so the institution and the county government simply became two parts of the same shadow. The land itself helped keep the secret, because a hollow in the Appalachian Mountains is not like a city block where a reporter can just walk door to door. People lived scattered across the ridges and connected by mountain roads that washed out with the rain, and in those isolated spots, the local power structure was the only law anyone ever knew. If you wanted to report an atrocity to the county, you were essentially complaining to the very people you were accusing. That is not a lack of bravery on the part of the neighbors, but rather a simple understanding of the math of survival in a place where the law and the criminal share the same last name. The status of the children did the rest of the work to ensure the silence lasted for generations. These were children without a voice, the ones whose parents had to sign an X on the intake forms because they had never been taught to write their own names. They did not have lawyers or powerful relatives to demand answers when things went wrong, and when they vanished from the official records, the quiet that followed was the same quiet that had defined their entire lives. The county leaders understood this as a fundamental truth, and it made every decision to look the other way feel like it carried no real risk at all. When we talk about a forgotten evil in a place like this, it does not mean the records were burned or the memories were wiped clean. The people living in that county knew exactly what was happening, but they knew it in the way you know something you have trained yourself never to look at directly. This knowledge was spread out and watered down among the population so that no single person had to carry the full weight of the guilt on their own. A construction worker saw the cramped bunks, a local reporter wrote a story that was killed by his editor, and a mother walked into a county office in 1952 only to be told her file was missing. Everyone held a tiny piece of the truth, but the county made sure those pieces were never allowed to fit together. The children who were never identified after they walked through those doors do not have a monument or a plaque to mark their lives. There is no headstone on the land where Sterling House once stood, because that ground has been repurposed and paved over
until the connection to the past was thin enough to break. All that remains of them are intake logs that end abruptly, placement records that were clearly falsified, and the cold math of 34 names that simply stop existing after a certain date. That is the only inheritance they were left with. The door leading down to that sub-basement was built with hinges that opened inward, which meant that from the hallway, it looked like nothing more than a solid wall. If you did not already know where to look, there was nothing to see, and that is exactly how the county wanted it. They built a wall with a hidden world on the other side, and they made a collective, practiced decision to never speak of what was behind it. Some of those 34 children were handed over to Sterling House by parents who truly believed they were doing the only thing they could to save them. Those children were never seen again, and their names never appeared in another official document from the moment they stepped inside. It took one locked door, one complicit county, and 50 years of silence to bury them. Subscribe if you want to help us uncover more stories like this, and please, share this video with someone who needs to hear the truth.